So how should we really think about mental health? For the longest time, we've basically seen it as a collection of separate, distinct illnesses. But what if that's not the whole story? What if it's all something much more fluid? Today, we're diving into a huge shift in thinking, moving away from putting our minds in neat little boxes and instead seeing them on a wide, continuous spectrum.
Just think about it for a second. When we use a word like depression, what do we actually mean? Is every single person's experience of it the same? I mean, probably not, right? Or could it be a mix of all these different underlying things, like maybe some anxiety, some deep sadness, or even that inability to feel pleasure, which is a state known as anhedonia? This one question, well, it gets right to the heart of a massive debate happening in psychiatry today.
So you've got these two big ideas. For a long time, we've relied on the first one, that mental health conditions are like boxes. You either check off enough symptoms to fit inside the depression box, or you don't. But this other idea is really gaining traction now. The idea that our mental states are on a spectrum, that different traits can overlap in, well, countless combinations. It's really the difference between a light switch that's just on or off and a dimmer slider that can be anywhere in between.
Okay, so first let's dig into that traditional view. This boxes approach has pretty much dominated how we think about and treat mental health for centuries. This traditional model has a formal name. It's called the categorical approach, and its goal was pretty straightforward. Create clear, separate categories for different diseases. It's basically a checklist. If you have symptom A, B, and C, boom, you get a diagnosis for disorder X. The whole point was to try and bring some order to a very, very complex field. And believe it or not, this idea has some seriously deep roots. We're talking all the way back to ancient Greece. It was really formalized in the 19th century by pioneers like Kraepelin, who started grouping symptoms into syndromes. You can think of these as the early versions of what we now call depression or schizophrenia. And all that work laid the foundation for the diagnostic manuals we still use today, like the DSM.
But here's the thing. As our science got way more sophisticated, especially with all the new medications being developed, we started to see the limits of these neat little categories. It turns out the boxes, they don't always fit. So what are the actual problems with this system? Well, for one, there's a ton of symptom overlap. You could have one person diagnosed with depression and another with an anxiety disorder, and they might share a whole bunch of the same feelings. This points to these underlying traits that just exist across different diagnoses. And this is a big one. A broad label like depression often isn't specific enough to help a doctor choose the best, most effective medication.
Let's really zoom in on that term for a second, because it's so important. Transnosographic. It sounds super technical, but it just means across diagnoses. Take something like impulsivity. It's not just a feature of one single disorder. Not at all. We see it in personality disorders, in some types of depression, in substance use disorders, and a lot more. It's this one single trait that just cuts across so many of those supposedly separate boxes. And that right there, that perfectly illustrates the problem.
So, in response to all these challenges, a whole new way of thinking had started to emerge. The idea is, if people don't fit neatly into boxes, well, maybe we're using the wrong shape. Maybe we should be thinking in spectrums. And this is what's known as the dimensional approach. I love how clearly this slide lays out the difference. The old categorical view is a switch. You're either on or off. You have the illness or you don't. But the dimensional view, that's a slider. Everyone is somewhere on a continuum of mood or anxiety or impulsivity. It suggests your unique mental state is more like a recipe, made up of different amounts of these core ingredients. Okay, so if we're going to use these sliders, how do we actually find them? How do we identify them? Well, researchers have two main ways of going about it. One is psychological and the other is biological. The psychological view, you can think of it like data science for the mind. It crunches huge amounts of data on symptoms to see which traits tend to cluster together, which can reveal an underlying source trait. The biological view, on the other hand, is a bit more like detective work. It tries to link a specific behavior, like impulsivity, directly to a physical mechanism in the brain, like, say, the serotonin system. And that biological approach has led to some absolutely incredible breakthroughs. Let's look at a classic example of this scientific detective work: the fascinating link between the neurotransmitter serotonin and the dimension of impulsivity. So here's how the investigation unfolded. Step 1 was an observation.
researchers noticed that people who had died by violent, impulsive suicide tended to have low levels of a serotonin byproduct. Okay, interesting. So next, step 2, they tested that link more broadly. And yep, they confirmed it. Low serotonin was correlated with aggression and impulsivity in general. But then came the real breakthrough. They found this biological link in people with many different diagnoses, not just one. And just like that, a dimension was born. Impulsivity was identified as a biological dimension linked to the serotonin system that cut right across all those old diagnostic boxes. So what does this all mean for the future? Well, this huge shift from boxes to spectrums holds this incredible promise of more precise, more personalized treatments. But as you can imagine, it also comes with its own set of very real challenges.
You know, the psychologist Raymond Cattell was onto this way back in 1980. He wrote that being able to measure these fundamental dimensions is incredibly important. And it makes sense, right? If you can actually measure something, you can potentially treat it directly.
And that's the great promise here. Instead of treating the big, kind of messy box we call depression, a doctor could target the specific dimension that's causing the distress, like anxiety or that inability to feel pleasure, anhedonia. The best analogy actually comes from cardiology. A doctor uses a beta blocker to treat a fast heart rhythm, and they do it no matter what disease is causing it. You treat the specific problem. But of course, it's not that simple. For clinicians, trying to assess 10 different sliders is way more complex than just checking boxes for one diagnosis. For patients, there's a risk of polypharmacotherapy, basically taking a different pill for each and every dimension that's out of balance. And for all of us, there's a huge philosophical question. Where do you draw the line? I mean, how far along a spectrum does someone have to be before we consider it a problem that actually needs treatment? So here's the bottom line. We are right in the middle of a massive paradigm shift. We're moving away from asking, what illness do you have, and starting to ask, which of your mental dimensions are causing you distress? And this leaves us with a really profound question for the future of mental health, one that's going to define the next generation of psychiatry. Should we be treating the diagnosis or the dimension?